so we can share this with people later. And let me go ahead and share my screen with everyone and do a pre-flight check, make sure everything looks good. I'm guessing y'all should see my screen about right now. David, give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Okay, we're good. Perfect. All right. Hey, thanks to everyone for joining me today. If this is your first time joining us, my name is Russell Graves. I'm coming to you live from the barn at Hackberry Farm in Dodge City, Texas. This is where I live. Uh, to explain the barn a little bit, this is what we call the barn that I'm in. We call it the barn, but it's not a barn in its truest sense of the form. We don't keep livestock in here, and it's just a finished space where I teach workshops when we have workshops on the farm. It's where I do a lot of my office work out of, and it's where I enjoy on an increasingly cold winter day like today. You can't see it, but I got a fire going in the wood burning stove over here. I'm looking out to the north at a gray and misty kind of day, and it's only supposed to get colder from here. When people tell you that we don't have winters in Texas, they've never been in North Texas before because it's supposed to be in single digits, I think, tomorrow night. So it's getting pretty cold up here. But with that said, today's topic of the webinar is focus on fundamentals and why focusing on the basics of photography is so important. And I mentioned this earlier when I was talking, but I'll just double down and say it again since everyone's here now. Uh, we I think that the technology of photography gets better and better every single day. I mean, every time I look at some photography blog, there's a new piece of equipment out meant to make life better. Now, with the invention of AI and the things you can do in post processing and the things you can do without even a camera, I mean, it's it's I'm not going to say it's making photography obsolete. I don't think photography will ever be obsolete because there's excuse me, there's one thing that you can't replace, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I think more than anything, with all these tools, it's still important to have a good sound fundamental base in photography for a couple of reasons why. And I talk about this a lot whenever I do workshops, when I have people in front of me. And one of those things is if I pause every now and then, I'm still letting people into the room. We still have people coming in. I ask this question a lot of people. When you think of iconic wildlife and nature photos, what images do you think of? And you don't have to answer me because just think of something for a second right now. When you think of really iconic landscape photo or a really iconic wildlife photo, what are the two photos you think about? And I'm telling you, whenever I ask that question, almost 100% of the time, people can name a landscape photograph that they say is iconic. About 80, 75 or 80% of the time, they can name a wildlife photo. But the point is, they always name the same landscape and wildlife photo whenever they do name something. And typically, 100% of the time, if I ask people to name an iconic landscape photo, they may not say this picture, the Snake River Overlook, the Tetons in the Snake River by Ansel Adams. They may say Oxbow Bend or one of the Yosemite pictures, but 100% of the time when I ask people that question, they always say the same thing, and they'll mention it's a Ansel Adams picture for good reason. I mean, the picture's beautiful. The guy was a master of the craft. Still got people trying to come in here. The guy was a master of the craft, and he just really, really understood what he was doing. And then the wildlife picture that people mention most of the time is this shot right here. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience has been to this exact spot before. I've, excuse me, I've been there many times, but it's this picture taken by Tom Mangelson. He calls it Catch of the Day. And if you look at the date there, well, let me back up one. Look at this Snake River shot by Ansel Adams. It was shot in 1942. If you look at this shot by Tom Mangelson, it was shot in 1988. I'm going to date myself here, but I was a senior in high school I was probably graduated high school when he took this picture because I'm guessing it was probably taken in July of 88 and I graduated high school in May of 1988. Uh, and so, but the two things have in common because in 1988, I'd already started doing photography. I got my first camera when I was 16 or 17, a little simple Vivitar camera, used film, of course, because there was no such thing as digital then. It was all manual focus, manual controls. It didn't have aperture priority or program or anything like that. I had to learn early on what shutter speed meant and what aperture meant. And then the ISO, if you ever shot film in the past, you know that whatever the film was in that camera, that was the ISO you were stuck with until you were through with the film. And most of the time, especially in the early days, I shot print film, but when I started wanting to do magazine work, I was shooting slide film, and that slide film was either ISO 64, Kodachrome 64, or it was ISO 100 speed film. Because if you got much more than that, the images were too grainy for magazine use. And so I mention all that to say that in 1988, I think he was probably using, I think a Nikon camera is what he shoots. So he was using a Nikon camera. It was more than likely a manual focus camera, manual settings all the way around, and probably on ISO 64, maybe ISO 100 speed film. But he captured an iconic picture in 1988 with gear that, although advanced for its time, is pretty basic compared to what we have today. And I don't think anybody would argue with that, because now we have the advantage of having these real lightweight cameras that we can take a field, digital, so you can shoot a lot of pictures and cull from what's good and what's bad. You can shoot at ISO, you know, 3200 and above and still be able to get a salvageable image. You've got eye tracking focus, the thing that doesn't miss. He had none of that when he shot this picture. Manual focus lens, uh, maybe he had aperture priority, but probably shot on manual, shot on ISO 64 or 100 speed film. So he had a lot of technical limitations against him, going against him. If we go back one, oops, if we go back one and we look at this picture shot in 1942, Ansel Adams had even more physical limitations that he was dealing with. These pictures, I don't know the exact camera, but I know I've seen pictures of him and read a little bit about him, that he used one of those view cameras that look like an accordion if you don't know what a view camera is. And you had to make each movement separate. You had a pan and a tilt, and you had to go real slow. And by the way, you had one piece of film at a time that you use. And so the technical limitations of shooting a picture like this were pretty extreme. I mean, do it in the field, and you have to take it into a dark room somewhere and develop it yourself. I mean, there's a lot of things that these guys didn't have that we have today that we take for granted. But the one thing, oh, and by the way, I failed to mention on this picture too. This is a guess, 1988, with that, because those cameras were all mechanical, and there may be a lot of people in the room that can correct me on this if I'm wrong. I'm not wrong by much. I'm wrong a little bit. 1988. These are all mechanical cameras, and because they were mechanical and there were a lot of moving parts inside of them, they were limited on how fast they could shoot. So I'm guessing this shot right here might have been shot at 5 or 6 frames a second. If you think about that now, I mean, there may not be a digital mirrorless camera made that'll shoot that slow. They're all shooting now at 20 and 30 frames a second and even faster than that. And so if you consider this iconic shot was made with such basic equipment, it's no wonder it's a wonder that they even shot pictures like that. And so what do these pictures have in common? And I say this a lot, they're both taken with basic equipment compared to today's gear. But the one thing those guys understood, of course, I never met Ansel Adams. I've met Tom Mangelson before, really nice guy. But the one thing those guys understood, and those are some of the guys I started, like Tom Mangelson, I started learning from early on, is they had a good fundamental base of photography. And I'm going to talk to you about the different things I consider the good fundamentals of photography, that once you master these fundamentals, it'll really take your game to the whole level. Because let's face it, photography for me, it's I almost compare it to being like a pro athlete, in the sense that, you know, baseball players, for example, get paid millions of dollars uh, to be able to hit a ball a third of the time. Football quarterbacks get paid millions of dollars to be able to throw a pass that's right on the money and be able to do it at 75 or 80% of the time. And so what makes those top level professional athletes so special is their ability to conduct whatever they're doing, whether it's hitting a golf ball or hitting a baseball or throwing a football pass or whatever it is they do. It's their ability to be consistent with it. And I've found that in teaching thousands of people photography and taking them all over the world, that's the one thing that people tend to struggle with. I'm not going to say a lot, but that's the key. You know, camera brands come and go. One day Nikon has the best, the next day Sony has the best, the next day Canon has the best, and the Olympus. You can throw all those in the mix. Cameras come and go, but the thing that people struggle with the most, I feel like, is just the consistency of being able to take a picture and you never have to look at it on the back of your camera because you know instinctively, you know all the fundamentals of photography and you know everything good enough that whenever you press the button on the camera, you're going to know intuitively that you got it good. And so those are the fundamentals I'm thinking about. Those little things that you can work on at home and work on them every day to help you get better. So that way, that technology that we use today doesn't become a crutch for your lack of skills. It becomes a complement to your skills once you know the good fundamentals. So, and by the way, if you've never joined one of my webinars before, I really like telling stories. So, uh, the the last the last B&H photo webinar I did last month. We're on hiatus this month. That's why I'm doing this on my own this month. But the last one I did for B&H Photo, they'll post it to the YouTube, and so you get to see the comments on what people say. And a couple of people mentioned uh, that they said some way. I'm probably being a little nicer about it than the way put it. I was a little long-winded at the first because I always like telling stories and telling analogies and telling metaphors and just kind of tying all this stuff back into things that make sense. Like the story I just mentioned about how I kind of think about photography and being consistent with photography. Uh, I compare it to a professional athlete. I think if you play golf, uh, golf and photography have a lot of good analogies because the greatest golfers in the world play the game knowing they're not going to play it perfect. And that's the same way with photography. You don't have to be perfect every single time. The key is just being consistent. Again, every time you try to take a picture of these center pivot irrigation circles out in far west Texas, I know once I took that picture, I had a pretty good idea of what the picture was going to look like because I could pre-visualize it in my mind, line it up. I knew what the setting should be, took the picture. Same way with the mule deer silhouette. That's up in Colorado. That's a big old fat mule deer too. If you look at him, that thing was humongous. His antlers were big, but his body was big old mature pot-bellied deer. I don't know if you knew this or not. It's kind of an aside. Deer, whitetail bucks age like people do. When they're young, they're really thin at the waist and broader in the shoulders and really muscular. But as they get older, they start developing like this guy does, and like I have a little bit of a pot belly. And so, and their neck gets a little saggy, and they age just like people. So you can look at a deer and be able to tell relative how old he is, if he's an old deer or a young deer, by looking at his body. And so that's definitely a mature mule deer buck right there. But took that picture and I knew what was going to happen when I took it. Same way with the sandhill cranes. When the moment counts and you take the picture, if you've got a good base of fundamentals, you don't have to worry about what the picture is going to look like in the end. Uh, any professional athlete, I'll tell you, that's what we're talking about. Without sound fundamentals, the best gear in the world won't help you get better. I mean, you could take, going back to the golf analogy, you could take me and Phil Mickelson and you could buy me the very best set of clubs made and the very best set of balls made and the best gear head to toe, the best shoes, the best gloves, the best everything you could give me. And I play golf. It's not one of my top hobbies, but I played golf. I played high school golf and I played it a lot, not in college, but through college and in my young adulthood and taught my kids how to play golf. But you could take the very best gear and put it in my hands. And then that same day, you could go to a garage sale and buy a 1952 set of blades and give them to Phil Mickelson and let him play with those and me play with the best gear. Who wins every time? It's always Phil Mickelson because he's got a better set of fundamentals when it comes to golf than what I do. And I, I, I will go to my grave saying this, that the fundamentals in photography are as important as the fundamentals in golf and baseball and anything else that you do outside of photography. I'll tell you the story about this picture, and that's why that's why I really like doing is telling stories about pictures. Uh, I figured out this is a wild pig out in West Texas. I lived in the Texas Panhandle for 26 years, and moved out there right out of college, and then moved back to Northeast Texas where I live now about 5 or 6 years ago. Wanted to be closer. My wife and I wanted to be closer to our parents as they got older. My parents live about a mile down the road. Her parents lived about 6 or 7 miles away. Uh, Anyway, just want to be closer for family. But when I lived out there, there's a lot of wildlife. By the way, if you ever hear me talking about Redlands Ranch, this is the area of Texas that Redlands Ranch is where I took this picture. But I noticed every time I would drive out, I started seeing wild pigs on my drive on this ranch I would go on. And so every day when I would go out there, I'd pour a little pile of corn on the ground just to feed them. Just corn like you go feed birds or whatever. I'd pour it on the ground and let them feed them. Well, pigs are smart. And after a while, they started figuring out when we see that white truck drive up, we're going to get fed. And so they're like cows. They just start showing up and waiting on me. And so I got this idea one day, and I knew just because thinking about all the fundamentals we're talking about in a minute, and I'll lay those out to you. I knew if I set my camera up and used a remote control to trigger it, if I piled corn right in front, I could get a picture of a pig with a 16 millimeter lens. And that's one thing I still try to do is try to think of different ways to shoot wildlife with a wide angle lens. And I was really, I mean, I knew the picture I was going for, but I was really surprised at how cool the silhouette of the sky looked when I shot this picture. And so you may be asking, what are the fundamentals? I think fundamentals fall into 5 categories. I think it's camera handling, and we'll talk more specifically about each one of these as I go through them. I'm going to give you an update of what we're going to talk about. I think it's a mastery of exposure. I'll give you some ideas on the things I think about when I'm thinking about exposure. Mastery of exposure, that's to me, if you mess up anywhere on photography and you mess up consistently, it's usually, or I usually mess up. I get the exposure wrong somehow. I'll tell you kind of what I've done over time to get better at that. Understanding your subject, I think that's huge. I just wrote, I don't know if anyone here, and I hope they don't, if they're listening, I hope I don't get in trouble for this. I don't know if anyone here subscribes to the Journal of Wildlife Photography, but I just finished an article for them this morning, and it's called the Mammal Calendar. I think it's coming out in their next issue. And one of the things I really talk about in that is understanding your subject. I think that even though that's not a hard camera technical skill, I think if you're into wildlife or any kind of nature photography, whether you do macro photography, whether you do wildlife photography, whether you do landscapes, whatever you do in nature, I think a good understanding of your subject goes a long, long way in helping you solve some of those technical problems. Right there, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I kind of figured out what those pigs were doing. I was able to kind of plan a picture in my brain and be able to be prepared for them to get this shot like that. And so, composition, that's another thing that people tend to struggle with, but the composition, it's a learned skill. All these are learned skills. I mean, I don't think any one of us are born being such a savant that you can pick up a camera when you're 4 years old and being able to make incredible pictures with it. So we all have to learn how to do this. And over time, if you practice it enough, composition comes to the point where it just becomes natural after a while. And then staying creative. I'm going to give you some ideas on what you can do to stay creative because believe me, that's a big deal as well. So that's in my mind, that's what I consider the fundamentals of photography are these 5 things. So again, we'll take questions in the end. So if you've got any questions, bring them to me. So camera handling, what do I mean by that? Oops, hang on, let me back up. I hit the button too quick. So with camera handling, I mean, just that. I mean, there's a right way and a wrong way to hold a camera. The people that I see, whether in my workshops here on Hackberry Farm or out at Redlands Ranch or we're traveling to Costa Rica, most of the people I see, they know how to hold their camera. But one of the key things that got someone else coming in. But one of the key things that I still am adamant about is if you got a tripod, you ought to use a tripod. And I say that because these new cameras we have today, they're miraculous. You know, they'll have 15 stops of you know, they may have 8 stops of in-body stabilization and 5 stops of lens stabilization for 13 total stops or whatever that number is. I don't know what it is, but David can tell you when you're when you're holding a heavy lens and shooting pictures of monkeys that are up in trees in Costa Rica, you've got about 20 stops of movement that camera just can't outrun. And so it's always best if you when you're talking about camera handling, particularly when it involves shooting telephoto lenses, the steadier you can hold the camera, the better. You'll go to somewhere, if you've ever been somewhere like Yellowstone in the fall, you'll see all these people lined up on the road taking pictures of a bear or coyote or whatever. And a lot of them are standing holding these big lenses like you see this gentleman here using, holding these big lenses, hand holding them, and they're standing straight up and down. And from the hierarchy of steadiness, that's the least steady way of holding a camera. Now, can you get sharp pictures like that? You absolutely can. I mean, it's a lot. You get to a point sometimes it's spray and pray. You can, but at some point, the truth is when you're standing straight up with holding a camera, there's about 300 joints between your toes and your hands that are conspiring against you to hold that camera steady. Uh, and then, and then the older we get, the more fatigued we get, the harder it is to hold a camera steady. So that's a long way of saying if you've got a tripod, I've heard all the stories before, and I know, and they're all right. They're cumbersome to use. They take a while to set up. They're, you can move quicker without them. All that's true. But I think in the end, if you're being honest about it, is it better to get a lot of sharp shots or go through your pictures and have a bunch that just aren't worthwhile because they're too sharp to fix? And I know they make this software now that can sharpen them, and the software is getting better and better. But I think that a better the better you can make your pictures out of the camera long term, for me at least, the more enjoyment I have in the process. Because the thing if you give me a choice, would I rather be taking pictures of toucans in the jungles of Costa Rica, or would I rather be sitting behind my computer culling through a bunch of pictures and finding out a bunch aren't sharp? I'd rather be outside, or finding pictures I have to work on. I'd rather be outside taking pictures. And so if you've got a handhold, the hierarchy goes: standing is your least steady way. Kneeling is better. Sitting is better. Laying down's the best. That's the most steady, with your elbows on the ground like a sniper position. But if you don't want to carry a tripod, a good uh, a good a good option to a tripod is carry a monopod, or use a sandbag to put on the vehicle, or use something just to steady that camera. Because again, when you're using a telephoto lens, because the image is magnified in the camera, every little bit of movement gets magnified at the same time. And you'll be surprised at how many, once you start using a tripod or some sort of support instead of just standing up and hand holding, how many more pictures will be just tack sharp. And at that point, you're letting your gear work for you, in terms of you're taking advantage of the maximum sharpness that camera and that expensive lens you got on the front of it can give you. Now, when we talk about landscape photos, landscape's different. You can get by with a little more movement in landscape because it doesn't magnify the image. You can get by with slower shutter speeds. But at the same time, I like tripods for landscapes because for me, it makes me slow down and think about what I'm taking pictures of. And it makes me think about composition and all those little keys that help go into a good landscape photo. Like, make sure you've got, and I talk about this in other webinars, make sure you've got an S curve running through the scene, or make sure you've got triangles that converge running through the scene. Make sure you don't have any limbs sticking in the side. Make sure you have nothing distracting. When I shoot landscape pictures on a tripod, I think that's really important as well. By the way, I will say this, and I'll send this link in the end. When we get done with this webinar, I'll send you a link. One of the things I've started doing in my field reports is I'll put the technical information into the on the pictures. I'll tell you, like, this is a picture of a baby howler monkey. Here's the recipe, how I shot it. This is the camera I used, the lens I used, the shutter speed, the aperture, and then the ISO I used. And one thing you'll notice is how slow a shutter speeds that I can shoot. And the reason why I can shoot that slow a shutter speeds is because I use some sort of support to hold the camera, because now I'm letting the camera work for me instead of me just trying to barely trying to keep from outrunning the camera's capabilities. So I think camera handling is really important, and that's kind of a lost art. I don't say a whole lot of things that are controversial, but if I say one thing that people deem controversial is use a tripod. You'll be glad you did. I'll tell you another story as an aside to that. When I was and of course technology's changed. When I was a young photographer, and this is when I say my young photographer, in my 20s, and I'd already started getting pictures on the cover of some magazines and in some magazines, and I was really kind of, my life goals were coming to fruition, because early on I wanted to shoot pictures for magazines and tell stories about rural areas, and so I was getting to do a lot of that. But my pictures, when I would look at them, and these were all slides back then, they just weren't as sharp as what I hoped they would be. And so I reached out to a photography mentor friend of mine, and then again, 92, 93, something like that, 94. There was no such thing as email. So it's talk about an old school way of doing things. There's no such thing as email or web galleries then. And so for him to see my pictures, I had to boxed up a bunch of slides and took it to his house. He lived 90 miles away. Drove to his house. We looked at them on the lot box. And I said, my pictures are good, but they're just not great. What do you think I ought to do? And he says, do you have a tripod? And my excuse to him was, no, I'm 24, 25 years old. I'm young and strong. I can hold that stuff pretty steady. And he's like, you can't hold it because you've got the magnification. You can't hold it as steady as you think you can. Get you a tripod. So I went home and I took his advice. I went home, and at the time I didn't have I had just a cheap little Velbon tripod. It wasn't very good at all. And it sure wouldn't hold my biggest lens I had then, which at the time was a 300 millimeter f2.8, and I'd put a teleconverter on. And I went home and I called up B&H Photo again. This is pre-web days, so it's back in the day when you had to actually call someone to make an order. Called B&H Photo. I ordered me a Manfrotto 3221 tripod with a pretty nice ball head with it. It cost me like $140, and I had it shipped to my work. Now, the perks of living in a small town is UPS drivers not only know where you live, but they also know where you work, and vice versa. And so I was waiting on the day I thought that package was going to come. They never brought it to my work, I was teaching school at the time. And so when I got home from school that evening, I walked into my living room. My wife was already home, and I saw this long box that was unpacked with the packing and a tripod laying on the couch. And I knew I was dead because I was 24 or 25 years old. We hardly had enough money to buy us beans to eat for supper at night. And then here I am buying a $150 tripod, and my wife was livid at me. And the only thing I knew to say to her was, hey, if I'm ever going to be a famous photographer, I got to have the best equipment. So just back off. And she didn't take that too kindly. I got in a lot of trouble over that tripod. But like any good husband would, and I think some of y'all can identify with me on this one. Like any good husband would, every time I've used that tripod, which by the way, I still own it. Every time I've used that tripod to shoot a picture that appeared in a magazine that made money for the family, I'd make sure I rub that into her. And I've been rubbing that into her for about 31 years now. So she's still with me, still got the tripod, so everything worked out in the end. But that tripod, me taking that guy's advice and buying that tripod and using it religiously, made all the difference in the world on how my pictures and the sharpness of my pictures and how they looked. And again, I know the technology's changed now, but that's, to me, tripods are still really important. I think mastery of exposure is really important too. The thing about exposure is these cameras are getting better and better at exposure, but the problem is they're not so smart that they know what you're looking at. This is a classic example of an exposure that a camera will almost always get wrong. And I'll break it down for you if you don't know what I'm talking about. A scene like this mule deer buck, he's backlit, he's against a dark background. These cameras are all calibrated. The cameras that are made today are calibrated the same way that they were made in 1988. Whenever they started putting meters inside of cameras, I don't know when that was, but whenever they started putting light meters inside of cameras, they were all calibrated to the same standard, which is 18% gray. I don't know why they call it 18% gray, but if you think about your histogram, you've got purely black on one side, purely white on the other side, but right in the middle is 18% gray. And so all these cameras are calibrated to the same spot. The cameras that were made 50 years ago are the same calibration as they are today. That's why if you know photography and you know the fundamentals, you can pick up the oldest cameras there are and still make good pictures with them. And still be able to do a good job with them. They're a little slower and a little more cumbersome, but you could still take good pictures because if you understand how exposures are calculated. And so because of that, cameras are really good. If it's a middle tone scene, I'm looking out north here, it's just green grass and some it's just some green winter grass in my field out front with some tan grass in the background and kind of a gray sky. If I pointed a camera at that scene right now, the cameras, because all the colors are right in the middle of the spectrum, cameras are pretty good at figuring that out. But where they have trouble is pictures like this with really dark backgrounds. If you do wildlife photography, you see a scene like this all the time. You have a middle tone subject like a deer, for example, or a coyote or a bobcat. A lot of these animals we see in nature are right there in the middle tone. But when they're standing against a dark background, the camera sees all that darkness in the back and it tries to account for it. If I were to let the camera decide the exposure on this, the camera would try to overexpose this image. It'd try to lighten up the shadows, and in result, you'd lose all these really cool highlights around the deer's muzzle and around his ears. The opposite of that, this is a little hard to me when you do the two extremes. This is a little harder to comprehend than the one that I'm about to say, that everyone can identify this. I'm not asking for a show of hands, just only in your mind, but how many people, and I'll show my hand, I'm guilty of this too. How many people have ever been out in the snow and taken a picture of something in the snow, and when you look at the picture looks gray and dull, and the snow doesn't pop really white like you expect it to? Well, the camera's doing the opposite of what it would do in this scene. Anytime you have a scene that has a really bright background or a really dark background, the cameras just don't know how to handle that. They try to make everything 18% gray. So it's up to you to use the best tool in your toolbox, and that's your noggin, to understand that, okay, this is going to be a dark background. I know my camera is going to try to overexpose this image, and so I need to compensate that somehow. If you shoot all manual, you compensate it by changing your shutter speed, making your shutter speed a little bit faster, usually not over one stop. If it's a bright background, and I don't know if I have a bright background here or not. If it's a bright background, and the camera is going to tend to, like snow, and the camera is going to tend to underexpose it, I know I've got to either dial a longer shutter speed, or I've got to dial a +1, add more light to the scene on my exposure compensation. If I use aperture priority a lot, that's why I use exposure compensation. I know I've got to do a +1 and make a slower shutter speed and let more light into the camera. By the way, as an aside, and I think everyone can agree with me on this as you're learning this stuff, I've talked about these topics for a million times in my life, and I still have to slow down and think about them. If I ever get to invent anything, if I ever get lucky and can invent one thing, I want to invent a time machine, and I want to go back in time and find the guy that invented these photography terms like open up and stop down and all these things that makes it confusing when you're thinking about them, and give that guy a good talking to. But because again, all I'm looking at is, when I go out, I'm looking at the scene and I think to myself, this is how I mastered exposure in my mind. I'm thinking to myself, do I think my camera will get this right? Again, if it's a middle tone scene, green, tans, kind of the middle of the spectrum, not pure black, not pure white, the camera will usually get it right. But if it's going to be a dark background like this, I know my camera is going to tend to overexpose it. So I've got to do a -1. The picture is going to be too bright. I got to take light away. So I got to do -1. And so I got to either dial that in manually or do exposure compensation to expose for that. You can do that in post processing, but I prefer to do less post processing in the end and get it right, because again, just understanding your camera, why it does that, it's one of the good fundamentals I think is so important. Ask Ansel Adams. I mean, that's what his whole workflow, his in the field workflow as well as his developing workflow, are all based on understanding exposure. And I'm saying the same thing. If I'm, we're not going to get snow this week, but you guys up north that are getting snow, if you go out to take pictures, just know your camera is going to tend to underexpose the image. It's going to make the snow look dark and gray. And so you've got to add more light to that, because the image looks dark. You got to add light and then compensate for that, either an exposure compensation or dial it in manually. And it's just a 1, 2, 3 dance I do every single time. Now, I will tell you this, here's a mathematical truity. I've got this software on my computer that I can analyze all the metadata in my pictures. And I want to say right now, I've got about 825,000 images in my catalog, digital images in my catalog. Of those pictures, I'm going to say, and I'm a little off on this, but just for conversation's sake, ballpark, I'm going to say probably I've used some sort of exposure compensation on about 150,000 of those. And so follow me here on this point. Of the 150,000 I've used exposure compensation, or I've had to change the exposure off what the camera said it ought to be, either on a dark background situation or a light background situation, 85% of the time, and these are all real numbers here, 85% of the time, all I have to do is either underexpose it by one stop or overexpose it by one stop. There's occasions when you have to go more than that, because if you think about your camera and you look at the bottom, you've got the 0 in the bottom, then you have a -1, -2, -3, and all the little tick marks in between. And that can drive you crazy thinking about, is it minus a third? Is it minus two thirds? Is it minus two and a third? Where is it? I can tell you with mathematical certainty, it's almost always 85% of the time. If if you've got a dark background like this and you know the camera's going to overexpose, you got to underexpose by one stop, minus one. If it's a bright background like snow and you know the camera's going to underexpose that and you got to add light to it, it's usually a plus one. Now, sometimes there's gradients in between, but that'll get you in the ballpark each and every time. And so when I talk about mastery of exposure, I'm really just talking about understanding how your camera is going to see a scene when you look through that and what you need to do to compensate for that on the back end. And then you get cool pictures like this, like that picture right there of the elk. That's a tricky exposure. You got direct lighting right on the elk, but you've got that dark background. The camera would tend to overexpose that image. On the bottom there of the backlit flowers, because it's such a bright background, the camera would tend to underexpose that image. So you just got to know what the camera is going to do and be able to compensate accordingly for it. And so we talked about this a little bit earlier, but understanding your subject, that was one of the pigs that would come to eat too. I just changed the exposure a little bit and wanted to, instead of doing a silhouette, I wanted to do a backlight. So a lot of times in a backlit situation like this, if you're wanting to get detail in subjects, I always think about who's the star of the show. What do I want to be the star of the show? Because on a scene like this, if you look at the histogram, the camera's going to tell you you got the exposure all wrong. It's going to be blinking all that. That whole sky will be blinking at you if you've got that function turned on your camera, because it's going to say it's overexposed. And it is overexposed, but the sky is not the star of my show in this one. It's the pig. As long as that pig is exposed correctly, that's all I was really, really worried about, because that shot right there was intentional. I wanted a pig uh backlit so you could see kind of, again, that fringe of light around it, and wanted to be able to really get this is shot with 16 millimeter remotely. I wanted to be able to get right up in the pig's face. So I knew to do that, I had to overexpose the scene a little bit, to the point my camera was telling me I was doing it wrong. But because I have a good understanding of exposure, I knew what it was going to look like in the end. The silhouette picture I showed you a while ago is the opposite of that. The camera was trying, because there was so much dark areas in the picture, camera was trying to overexpose a little bit, where I was getting too much detail in the subject. I didn't want detail, I wanted a silhouette. So in that other picture, I had to underexpose it a little bit. But understanding your subject is key. By the way, all these things we're talking about today are not only good for wildlife and nature photography, but they're also good things to think about when you're talking about taking pictures of grandkids playing baseball or playing soccer or doing a play at the school or whatever else. These fundamentals are good for all kinds of genres of photography, including understanding your subject. One of the things I used to do for fun when I was a teacher, just to practice my skill set as a photographer and to help out the kids, is I would show up on Friday nights, because I didn't like sitting in the stands watching football games. I'd show up on Friday nights uh, and take pictures from the sidelines of them playing football. And so one of the things that helped me be successful in doing that is I just understood the game of football and understand where the play was going to go and who I was most likely to be able to get good action shots of at any given play at any given time. So understanding your subject, whether you're talking about anything photographically speaking, is really key. And I think it's especially key, and that's what I mentioned earlier about a preview. It's especially key when you start shooting wildlife photos. One of the things I talk about from time to time is, when it comes to photography, is controlling all the variables of a shoot that you can control up to the point it becomes uncontrollable. Since David's listening in, I'll use Costa Rica as an example. All the things I could control about that trip, I knew we could go down there. I knew we could stay in an awesome resort. I knew we could go to some beautiful places. But the one thing I couldn't, and so I controlled every variable of that to put the odds in my favor. Found the very best wildlife guide to take us around to show us the stuff. I controlled every variable I could. The only thing I couldn't control in the end was, are the monkeys going to show up? Or are the sloths going to show up? Or are the toucans going to show up? At some point it becomes out of control. But because I did control all those things, and I understood how to use my camera, and I understood all the fundamentals of photography like we're talking about, because I could control all that, when it came time to take the pictures, the odds were in my favor. Once we found something, the odds were in my favor that we were gonna be able to come away with some nice shots. And I talk that about me. I've been seeing people's pictures posted on Facebook and other places, and so I'm pretty confident in saying everybody was successful on that trip because all of us, both individually and collectively, controlled all the variables we could until the point where it comes down to you can't control them. So on this shot right here, to put this idea into practice, this was 100 yards behind my house where I used to live, and I had me a little setup where I'd mow an area to keep the grass kind of low. I wouldn't let the brush grow in. I built a blind. The blind was I used like a photo pills to figure out where the sun was. Built a permanent blind that I knew that when the sun came up, it'd be shining right down this lane, and knew the animals would move around all the time because I saw their tracks. Well, then it was a matter of just I put the blind in the right place. I knew photography. I did everything else right. And then the fleeting 5 seconds that this coyote showed up, I was there to take its picture, and everything clicked at that point. Everything was right. I controlled everything I could. And part of that, a lot of that is just understanding your subject. You know, a lot of wildlife pictures that you see, like Tom Mangelson's we looked at a while ago, they're not necessarily made by chance. They're made by understanding what you might see when you get there and being prepared when the moment presents itself. And that's what I mean by understanding your subject. So a few more wildlife shots. If you don't know what the little critter on the left is, the actual name of them is Texas horn lizard. That's the state reptile of Texas, but we grew up calling them horny toads is what we call them. But they're not a true toad; they're a lizard. But all these shots are just being prepared at the right time. To back up a little bit, the shot here of the horny toad and the shot of the cardinal on the fence post, the camera would see those scenes as medium tone, just like they would see this as medium tone. That's what I meant from the earlier slide of mastering exposure. The the high there's bits of black in there, but the middle tone, not purely black, not purely white, but somewhere in between dominates the tones of this picture as they do the horny toad and the cardinal. But I think you know where I'm going here. The picture of the ringneck ducks you see there swimming, because of that bright water, the camera would tend to underexpose that picture. So I just understanding that I had to compensate for it. And then the last thing is, I think the last thing, maybe there's no two more, I think composition. Composition's huge. It's one of those things. And composition, if you need a good simple definition, I put it like this. It's the way that the elements of a scene are arranged in the picture. And it's, no one's going to jail over any of this stuff, but there is kind of tends to be a right way and a wrong way to do composition. And so one of the things that I talked about intentionality a little bit while ago, one of the things I really try to do whenever I'm taking pictures is try to be intentional in the composition. Now that happens a little quicker when you're talking wildlife. In fact, this bear right here was the first brown bear I'd ever seen in my life. We landed on the beach in Katmai probably back in 2017. I got out of the plane, looked down the beach, and this was walking down the beach towards us. And so this was the first picture I ever took. But from a compositional standpoint, and this is cropped a little bit to fit this slide, but from a compositional standpoint, you can't see it here, but if you look at if you're staring at the bear, the right side of the frame, notice I've got a little more room on the right side than the left side. That's almost, if you looked at the full frame, that's almost a classic rule of thirds. I'm giving the animal a little bit of room to move into the right. And so the way I got better at composition is just looking at a lot of pictures and seeing what I liked and seeing what I didn't like, and making a mental note of that back in the day, and just trying to replicate what people who knew more than I do would do when they would take pictures. Today, we've got a great benefit of everyone has one of these guys that you can take with you, a smartphone in the field. And one of the things I do more often than not, when I see uh, pictures that I want to emulate, I'll just put a copy of pictures I want to try to take. Maybe other people have taken them, but I'll make me a gallery inside my phone so I can refer to that all the time to just to give me an idea of things to take. Right now, there's this big, I'm not a contest kind of guy. I've judged a ton of contests, but I've never really entered any until this year. And I've entered in this contest, and a lot of it's to validate my properties that I have, not only Redlands Ranch, but Hackberry Farm, because this contest, it's in Texas, but what they do is they'll, they'll take private landowners and team them up with photographers. And so during this February 21st, the contest starts this week, all the way till the end of May, the photographers have to take their pictures on their landowner partner's land. Well, I got to enter the contest as both a landowner and a photographer, and so I'm taking pictures of my own property. And so one of the things I've tried to do is look at these real creative pictures from all over the place of animals I may have here, but it goes beyond just a bird sitting on a stick. So I start thinking about how can I take pictures of these hummingbirds that that come into my feeders in the spring, or how can I take pictures of the snakes I find? And the way I do that is I look around and I find pictures that are inspirational to me, and I'll save a copy on my phone. And that's how I learn composition, by just looking at other people's pictures. This shot here provides two pieces of compositional gold that I like. Number one, if you've ever heard me talk about composition, I always talk about triangles, and I look for either curves or triangles to put in the picture. This one, you can see the land, the shape of the land, that's a triangle in the shot. And other than that, I've included the triangle, and then it's the classic rule of thirds. If you think about the tic-tac-toe grid laid upon that, that elk, sometimes it cheats a little bit, but that elk is almost in the right on the intersection line of the right third of the picture. But if you notice, all the empty sky is over to the on the left side of this image, and that's on purpose, because in general with wildlife stuff, you got to give the animal a place to look, or give the animal a place to move. If I'd have shot this picture where the edge of the frame was right beside the elk and he's looking against a hard edge like the edge of the frame, I don't think it would have been as powerful a shot. But from a compositional standpoint, practice, 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 and then practice some more, and then look to other people's pictures for inspiration if you think that's something you're struggling with a little bit. Man, I love bobcats. That's the one thing I hope to get some really good shots of during this contest period, or bobcats. I've got them on my place here, got them on Redlands Ranch. The hard part is bobcats like to be secretive, and so they see you a lot quicker than you see them. And then I love predators and all this other stuff. And then the last thing I want to talk about is stay creative. By the way, I know I said the webinar is going to be 12 to 1, but if we go a little bit longer, you're looking at the entire photography enthusiast community of Dodge City, Texas, right here. And so if anybody wants to stay 3 hours and talk about photography, I'll stay here with you, because I have no one else to talk with photography about. But stay creative. And that's to me, that's a good fundamental as well. And what do I mean by staying creative is, to me, I'd mentioned just a bird on a stick, on a limb, or on a fence post or something. Well done. Those are beautiful shots, and I always take advantage of them. But one thing I'm always trying to think about is, how can I take a shot differently? Can I shoot through a little bit of foliage and get some out of focus foliage in the foreground and the background and put the animal in the middle? Or how can I take a picture of a squirrel eating from the feeder in my backyard that makes it look like in the wild that's something a little more creative than I've seen? So I'm always thinking about ideas like that. And that goes a little bit beyond photography, but it's also I think it fits in the fundamental pocket as well. And so, or how, by thinking creative, that's how I learned that, people talk about astrophotography all the time, and the stars are a great time to take pictures. But I think just as equally as good time to take pictures is under a full moon night, when the moon illuminates the landscape for you, like you see here. This is a 5 minute long exposure. The stars are streaked a little bit, but the clouds are streaked really cool. And all the light in this picture, except the light you see coming from inside that old stone house, is all ambient light that comes from the moon. And and I'm always looking for creative ways of doing things. And then, so how do you stay creative? Uh, Read lots of magazines, and magazines are kind of a dying thing. I hope they don't die forever, because I love magazines, and I think we need things in our hands to hold. The whole world can't be digital, but that's the old guy coming out in me to say that. Read lots of magazine or online outlets that feature great photography, and I do that a lot. I still look at other people's photographies and for inspiration, and a good picture is a good picture no matter who takes it. I try to follow others' work, whether on Instagram or Facebook. Now the caveat is I don't get too far into it, because I have a bad habit of looking at other people's work, and I have start having this, why am I not, there doing that? And so I've got to really rein myself back and understand all I can do is all I can do. And so I've got to, I follow other people's works, but I look at it in measured doses. I don't just stay on Instagram or Facebook all the time. I get the input of others. I can tell you right now, if I put something on Facebook and I get a few hundred likes and, you know, 50 to 100 comments, I know I've done something good. And I don't have a ton of Facebook followers, but I know I've put something out there that people enjoy and it touched them in some way. If they don't respond, I kind of know, no one's mean enough to say anything bad about it, but I kind of know that, oh, maybe it didn't resonate like I thought it would. And so that's how I get the input of others. But what you could do is if you've got a photography mentor or call me, I'll give you input of, things you can do to improve. Most of the time, and I can tell you this, and I wish she was on here right now, I would pick on her a little bit, but most of the time, when people need to improve with photography, or at least the people I deal with, most of the time, it's never anything extreme. It's just little tweaks here and there, tiny tweaks that once you do it, it makes a world of difference. I won't tell you her name, but I'll tell you, she reached out to me and was kind of struggling. Her pictures weren't as good as she thought they should be. And I took a look at them and I asked her two things. One, are you using a tripod? And she said no, because I could look at her pictures and tell it. And then the second thing, I said, you really ought to work on getting a little bit closer to the animals because she was falling back on getting either using her car, taking pictures out of her window, which is not a bad way to go. I do a lot of that, or just getting out of her car and shooting pictures of an animal and then crop, 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 crop. Well, the more you crop, the more the flaws start to show up. And so I gave her two simple pieces of advice. I said, do this week. Use a tripod, try to get a little bit closer. And a little bit closer falls into that understanding the animals and understanding, the animal's body language and all that. And you're going to see miraculous results. And she contacted me like 4 days later and says, I can't believe it. She sent me the pictures. It was like a whole different photographer. So that's what I mean, that when you get from the input from others, in my experience, most people's issues they need to work on, and issues is way too strong of a word. Most of the things people that need to do are just tiny little tweaks, and if they'll do this one little thing, it makes a world of difference. And I also say this is for people like me who take pictures all the time. Uh, that old saying that absence makes the heart grow fonder. I find with me, if I put my camera away for a while and just kind of leave it aside and don't mess with it, when I go back to it, I kind of start seeing things in a whole new and creative sort of way that I think really benefits me in the end. So there's a such thing as too much of a good thing, because if again, using the golf analogy, if you've got a bad hitch in your swing and you keep trying to practice that same hitch, that bad hitch isn't going to go away. Sometimes it's best just to set it aside, approach it, a few days or a couple weeks later with a new set of eyes and a fresh approach, and help solve your problems. And that's how I stay creative. So with that, does anybody have any questions at all for me on this? Uh, I finished the webinar in time. It's 12:58 now. If anybody has any questions, or if didn't make sense on something or need to go back over something, let me know. You'll have to turn on I don't think I can turn on everyone's volume at the same time. So just turn on your volume and I'll be happy to answer any question that you have on anything.
Russell?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm still learning my process here in to get to reasonably good photography.
Uh-huh.
So I love the walk that you took us through on the fundamentals. If I'm going to attack these, is there an order that you would suggest I start with?
I think kind of the order I went in, really. I think it's important to, if you don't, you gotta, there are two things that go hand in hand. I think that's a good question too, David. I never thought about it this way, but if you got an understanding of exposure and what what shutter speed's enough to capture an image. The old standby is your shutter speed has to at least equal what your focal length is. So if you're shooting a 500 millimeter, you ought to be shooting at least a 500th of a second to handhold it. And so it starts with the understanding of exposure of what you can and can't get away with. And then it starts with the fundamentals of just camera handling after that. What are you going to do if you're shooting pictures of wildlife to hold that camera as steady as you can? And so I think those two kind of go hand in hand. And then you start building on the composition and the creative part of it after that. Because half those fundamentals I talked about, or a little more than half those fundamentals are hard skills. They're left brain stuff. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO, just the procedure on how to make all this stuff work and the process on how to make it work, as well as camera handling. And then the other half is more creative stuff. And the creative stuff usually is what comes last for everybody, in my experience. Some people are naturally talented on the creative stuff, but I would say that's few and far between. Most people get a good understanding of the nuts and bolts of photography, and then they start getting better at the creative side. So I would say the nuts and bolts come first, and then the creative side. And I say that because if you put creativity in the front of it, if you have a poor knowledge of the nuts and bolts of photography, your output won't be good enough to outrun no matter how creative you are. I could be the most creative photographer in the world, but if I'm trying to shoot wildlife pictures at 1/10 of a second, it's never going to work. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I would emphasize your focus on camera handling. I think that was one of the things I really learned in our trip last week. Was I looked through the pictures I've taken, and I realized that at my age and with the weight of the equipment and everything, I got to find better ways to stabilize and hold the camera for better quality pictures. I'm not throwing as many away.
Yeah.
And that one, when you brought that up, it really came to me because of my recent experience and what I learned about that camera handling piece on our recent trip.
And that's true of everybody. And that's something I don't know that enough people, you can go online right now and find webinars and educational stuff and videos on using Topaz and using all those things to correct what you didn't get right. And it seems like not enough people put emphasis. That's why I said if I say anything controversial, it's use a tripod because that simple piece of equipment erases so many negative things that you may introduce into the photographic process. And again, it's all those joints that conspire against us, and it's age, and it's also, it also not for fear of. I don't mean to sound sexist when I say this at all, and I'm not meaning that. But the truth is that my wife, she could not hold my 500 millimeter lens as steady as I could hold it, and even I start to get weaker from it. So there's all these variables, just as the difference there's just the diversity in how we are as people that get introduced into the whole matter. But one simple thing, a tripod or a monopod fixes almost all of that. It equalizes it for everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Russell, can I ask,
Hey, Jack.
um, would you comment on wildlife images with a wide angle lens? I remember your gorilla picture was 35 millimeters with a 1.2 lens, and that seemed counterintuitive to me, but I heard you say it again about wildlife pictures with a wide angle lens.
Yeah,
Can you expand on that a little bit?
it is counterintuitive. I just think that, I mean, this is all part of me staying creative and trying to figure out new ways of taking old pictures. I think that, and it also falls into that part about understanding your subject. One thing I'm always trying to do is come up with new ways to take pictures of old things. And so I've got, there's a good example. I've got thousands of pictures of coyotes. Love coyotes. I never pass up an opportunity to take pictures of one. But I don't have any taken with a 35 or 16 millimeter lens. And so during this contest, I'm gonna try to figure out ways to take pictures with that. It just adds a whole new dynamic to it. And it is counterintuitive because what you're trying to do is on me, it's almost like remember the old Looney Tunes cartoon, The Coyote and the Roadrunner? where the Coyote is always trying to outsmart the Roadrunner, but the Roadrunner always end up winning in the end. When it comes to these predators on this contest, I'm going to try to be like the Roadrunner. I'm going to try to outsmart those animals and get them to move closer to me instead of me having to move closer to them, whether physically or optically. And by me, I mean my camera's set up on a tripod or some kind of hidden support that I can take pictures of them when they're walking down a trail or where they're doing something else. And it's no more than being creative. I end up failing a lot when I try that jack, but I'm okay with failing. I mean, I think failure is part of the process. I mean, every one of us is, taking bad pictures. I think I said it. I don't know if you were there, Jack. I know I said it to somebody on Costa Rica. I said, you're going to get good pictures. Don't beat yourself up for the bad ones, because we're all on that trip. We're all going to take bad ones, because it's, how do you predict? We got back to that Costa Rica thing. We got into a pod of 250 to 300 spotted dolphins, and they were jumping everywhere like popcorn. You know how many good pictures I got of those dolphins? About 4, because the rest of them were a bomb. It was just not easy. And so I think failure is all a part of it. And I think people tend to be too hard on themselves if they don't get everything just perfect. Those things I talked to you about today are going to help you get closer to perfect, but oftentimes in photography, perfection can be the enemy of the good. So I hope that answers your question, Jack. Hey, before I take any other questions, if anyone has it, they've got a couple on the chat. Randy asked, hang on a second. Oh, there we go. Randy asked, my question is, what image compensation stop level do you suggest? My cameras offers third or half stops, EV stops. Randy, on that, I really don't think it matters. I mean, if you're a third of a stop off the exposure, that's something fairly easy enough to do in post-processing. And so I'll leave mine on third stops, just because it's just what all my cameras have always been set at, and I just haven't changed it. So, but half stops would be enough. And like I said earlier, it's usually no more than 1 stop plus 1 stop or minus 1 stop on exposure compensation. 85% of the time, it's what I find out it's going to be between those two. So if you were at half stop, that'd give you less. You'd have less clicks to make to get to -1 or +1. So that'd be the advantage I would see on that. And then Dick just says, thanks, Russell. Thank you, Dick, for showing up today. So does anybody else have any questions at all? Well, with that, then, thank you guys for spending time with me. And like I said, I'll send out the meeting notes in the end, and I'll post this video and send a link out to everyone. So if you want to review it and watch, as always, I always look forward to seeing people. I know Jack's been here a bunch. I've spent a lot of time with David, and I really do cherish the friendships I make through doing this. So I'd love to see some of you guys sometime if you hadn't been with us before. And in the meantime, just stay tuned, because every month I do one of these webinars, and love to see you again at some point. So if no one else has any other questions, I'll let you guys go for now, and I will talk to everybody soon. Thank y'all.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Russell.